I'm Rashid Ogundlari, coach, speaker and author, and I'm so thrilled to be here with my good friend, colleague, Kathleen O'Hara. I'm so excited about this. This is one of my new inspiring interviews, and yours is quite an inspiring, extraordinary story and journey. You're author of a grief like no other. You've been a healer and a therapist for many, many years. You've been through extraordinary tragedy also, but you also help people to really transform and find self. And I remember we met a few years ago at an event, and we spoke there, and then we've had this kind of dialogue. And one thing that struck me once we began that dialogue is this important work that you do, helping people to truly transform. I'm just wondering where it is that we should begin. Tell us a little bit about, just in a nutshell, to kick us off, your journey in your words.
Well, I became a therapist 20 years ago because I believed in, I saw my own life transform through therapy, so I wanted to become a therapist, and I was trained in California at the California Institute of Integral Studies. Graduated in '93, started a general practice of integral health and awareness and spirituality and so on. I was trained in somatics, body-mind therapies. Right. So my practice was at that time in Colorado, had a good 5 years, moved back to Philadelphia where I was born and raised, and my oldest son was in college at the time, and my life was about to change in ways I could never possibly imagine. And one day, about 9 months after I moved back, I got a call from the police in Ohio that my son had been abducted with his roommate, and they couldn't find him.
And that must have been just a horrific, unsettling moment, because presumably what does that mean? And my goodness, I can't believe... I get the feeling from you just saying that at that moment, everything shifted.
I remember feeling like my life was going down the drain, and I was watching it swirl.
What, that was just even being on the phone, or
just being on the phone, because it was like the bottom dropped down. And on the one hand, I was listening, you know, and my objective self was trying to ask questions, but my emotional being went into trauma and shock. And this is what happens in trauma. Whatever the trauma is, we freeze. And we may be actually functioning, you know, in that fight or flight mode. So we figure out what we have to do, we figure out where we're going to be, so the mind is sort of working. The adrenals are really pumped up. Right. But we're in shock.
And it's interesting, just to put the context, we're here, and it's been a sunny day, but actually there's thunderstorms brewing, it's noisy outside, there's all sorts of construction going on. And there's something, it could be a sunny day in one's life, and then suddenly the storms.
Right, out of nowhere. And you know, that's really the case, isn't it? I mean, if we got up in the morning and could read the newspaper about our life that day, we would then be more prepared, or not. We might not have a very good day at all. Right. So the way life works is you never know when you get up in the morning what kind of a day it's going to be. You hope for the best. And I think that optimism is part of the transformation. Can you regain your optimism after even the worst things that happen? And that's been a real struggle. Right. And I write about that in the book. Right. You know, you know, during one of the exercises, you know, remember who you were the day it happened. Right.
So for those people who don't know your whole story, so you've got this call. Right. And something awful happened, your son being abducted. Right. And just tell us a little bit more about that, and then on what unfolded from.
Well, he was a student at Franciscan University, which was a small family Catholic college. He went there to live the life. He was a really great spiritual person. And apparently the house had been broken into, and that's all the police would tell us. So we got in a car with my son and daughter and a friend and drove up there. It was Memorial Day in the States, which is when you celebrate the war dead, which I always have thought, my God, what a day to have it happen. But anyway, we went there. All the students were coming back, you know, because by that time everybody wanted to know what happened to Aaron and Brian.
Right.
And we arrived on that Monday, gotten a phone call Sunday night, and proceeded to search for them. We had 100 agencies searching for 5 days. And you can imagine just it was something that, you know, I look at it now 15 years later, and I can speak about it because I've done that for so many years, but there's still, did that really happen? Can that really happen? And we know it does. They were found 5 days later, and they had been taken to the woods and shot by 2 addicts who had been high on crack. We always felt that it was something, they had a gun, and they were pretending they were gang members.
Right.
And I think they were around, you know, living in a house they knew the students were.
Right.
They didn't even really know their names.
Right.
So, you know, that was the journey of my life.
And then your life just complete change.
Right.
You talk about in your book kind of oceans of grief and different stages of grief, and I also just something that straight away I think that struck me. I remember reading, and your book is so profound that the spirit of your book, I had just got a few pages into it, but I deeply understood already from trauma to transformation what your book was. So somehow it was so it's so clear to me. The work that you do now, because you do extraordinary work now. You work with many people who are going through trauma, many people who perhaps have lost loved ones through to violent death
Or
sudden death. You work with victim groups in the UK, in the USA, in Europe, internationally, and you are a transformational healer. It's quite ironic, well, isn't it ironic? The thunderstorms globally at the time when we're talking about, there's a lot of unrest in lots of places in the world. One of the things that strikes me about you and your story is that how you manage to find self, wisdom, and the strength to carry on, not just carry on, but doing your work in the world. And this is something that I think is really important, because I think one of the things that I've discovered in life journey is that very often we're caught up in very low levels of trauma.
Yes.
But that stops us from being fully in the world. How on earth did you find yourself to move to this particular point in life? How did that happen?
I think that what I experienced is a universal process that we all go through, no matter how bad the trauma is, or maybe a trauma that's less traumatizing, but it's all relative, isn't it? You know, people are traumatized every day. It does not have to be a homicide or a suicide. It could be losses of many different kinds. But how, I think, first and foremost, as a therapist, I knew it was a process. I was unprepared for the depth of the process. You know, it brought me to the edge and then pushed me over.
And also, I'd imagine that moment is that there can be the aware of it as a process, but then there for you as a mother, as a human being, it's an unfathomable event. So it's actually just, it's real. I mean that.
Right. I think the difference was I knew there had to be edges somewhere.
Right.
The trouble was I had no idea where they were. I knew theoretically that this was a really bad time and that I had to go through it like any other experience. I just was unprepared for the depth and the edges of that ocean, which seemed to be endless. And I think when I work with trauma victims, that's what they will say. How long do I have to do this? Because I don't think I can do it for any length of time, because the pain is so extraordinary. And what I always say is the way you feel today is not how you're going to feel in the future, but you're going to have to feel this today. And that's fundamental. We cannot escape that. And part of the process, and the important part of the process, is to feel the actual pain and not short-circuit it. As if you could, you really can't. But to recognize that the pain will not kill you. Running away from it. You know, when I talk about the learning how to ride the waves of grief. you
Right.
know.
And I think what you're saying here is very profound if we relate it to anything. I think that very often we're trying to run away from fear or feelings generally.
Mm-hmm.
But I think if one can honour that they're real and that they're real, that then there can be understanding. The healing perhaps can then take.
Well, I think, I
take
think
place.
when psychologically, and from let's just say from a psychological standpoint, one of the theories is a catharsis happens.
Mm-hmm.
Well, catharsis cannot happen if you're repressing the emotion and you're putting it in a room and you're not dealing with it. Now, the thing about these kinds of trauma is very rarely can you put it in a room. People do, but it's extremely, because it has so much energy to it.
Right.
It's all consuming. And quite frankly, I didn't work that year. There was very little I could do, because the waves of emotion would overcome me and I'd be crying hysterically.
I'm presuming the waves of emotion for you, but did you also find that the waves of emotion from everybody around you didn't know how to cope with these events? Because there's some life events. It's interesting what you said about picking up the newspaper and if we can know what's going on that day. And we kind of play these games with ourselves. Of this is going to happen this week. This is going to happen this month, and da 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 da. But we actually don't know. Presumably, what you find and what other people have found is that other people just have got no way of beginning to know what to say, how to respond, how to engage. Is it almost that the ripples of that waves of emotion that they also can't handle? Does that happen?
And I think many of us will talk about that. Like so-and-so, what we perceive is they ignored us, they didn't say, well, it's because they didn't know what to say. People don't know. I mean, what do you say when, two young men were taken off, beaten, tortured, and left for dead? I mean, what do you say to a person like that? So I understand that. And I wish people would know that something is better than nothing, but try not to say anything really stupid.
Yeah.
It's better to say something like, if you ever need to talk, I will be here. I may not know what to say, but I will try to be here with you.
So that presence, it's the presence. So that's very, very important.
Right. Or maybe you just, like I know some of the girls who were at the college came and did everybody's laundry they just came with bags because we were there for a week. And we'd only, and they disappeared and they came back with they did not ask. They just did it. Or bringing food or those kinds of things. But
as you say that, something just strikes me, and that's that ironically in life it would seem that only when the really pronounced things happen, and I talk about this all the time, that the divorce, the separation, the bereavement, the loss, the tragedy, the ill health, the terminal health, that really wake us up to life. And that's, we've done this talk, living life whilst there's still time. Is that something that you found over that journey? That seems to be the case, that so often we don't wake up to this lovely experience of being here.
Right. Until it's too late. And then you're not even sure you're ever going to wake up, or that you want to wake up. And that's the thing to realize, that once this thing happens, it's much harder to find the joy. Because, and I knew that. I mean, sure, I laughed, and I wasn't, in bed for a year, but it was a pretty bad first year. And the joy had just been taken away. Now, it's returned, but it's always shadowed by that trauma. And so the thing I want to say is that before something like that happens, we should be experiencing joy.
Right.
Not waiting. Because if I had known that I would only have my son for 20 years, I think I would have been much different. Or if I was going to experience that with his death, I would have lived life much differently.
And is that on a personal level as well as with your son and with family?
I think in all things, relationships would have become more precious. You just think that people are going to be there. You get busy. You're doing what we all do. It doesn't make us bad people. We're just running around. And I think sometimes mothers in particular are so busy with all the, and the men are busy making a living to take care of the kids that you forget that this could be taken away from you at any time. In anything, our health, our homes, our jobs, all the things that we count on. We have to find some inner resilience by the way to be able to cope, number one. And number two is to appreciate the moment while we're here.
Right.
And not have it informed by tragedy.
And ironically, as you're saying that, we're so caught up with the appreciation, getting this, getting that, going out to work, doing all that stuff. It takes us away from being present and the appreciation, the true appreciation of life and that we have, the connections, the relationships, the friendships, the fun, whatever it is, whatever much or whatever little it is that we have. But we're so caught up in all of that and what we need to be that we're never there. It's almost, I often say that it's almost as that in life, people often, they never meet. Even husband and wife, this person, that, or best friends, often they never, sometimes best friends will have actually met, but to truly meet and to be available and to appreciate this experience. Because I think what you're already saying is so profound. And I think one of the things that struck me and why I'm so keen to speak to you is that one of the things I think that I've learned on this journey is that we get so caught up in the stories that we've been told about ourselves, which are usually just not true. They're a story. They're a perspective of a version of a series of events. That we don't know who we are, we don't know that magic, and therefore it stops us from being in the world. And I think that what's for me very important about your work is that you're able to cut through that noise. Because you have experience when these really serious things, and you're able to cut through, so people hear your voice when they may not hear any others. And just as when these serious events, that whatever they may well be, unfortunately they're rarely that pronounced, that they are that invitation every time when we happen to lose a loved one who's got to a certain age or a certain stage or whatever, or you hear that somebody's, is that reminder to just be so appreciative of life. I want to explore a little bit about the work that you do now and what the work is about, because I could talk to you for so long. Can you tell us what happened in the intervening years? You already were a therapist, you already passionate, and you'd already done therapy with, that struck me that there was the conventional side of the therapy, but you're also interested in the spirit, with this, the spirit of who we are. Tell us a little bit about that and what your work is really about now.
Well, as you say, I was always involved in transformational therapy. Really, the realization of the unconscious mind becoming one with the conscious mind and yearning towards that transformation, the best that we can become, the integrated version of body, mind, soul, spirit, right? Emotional, mental, physical, and spiritual. That's a tall order, but that's really what life is about.
Right.
Now, when this happened with my son, I was absolutely confronted with that. Practice what you preach.
Yes.
How are you going to transform this thing? Will you allow this violence to destroy you or transform you? And I have to tell you, sometimes it was very close because I felt like I couldn't deal with the ongoing pain. So there was about a year and a half there that when I say didn't do much in the world. It was an interior journey completely about surviving.
Right.
You know, because that something as brutal as that puts you on the survival path. It isn't really about anything else. Now, at a certain point past that, when you learn how to deal with whatever the situation is, you do move forward. There is a protocol, and I talk about that in my book. So what happened was about a year and a half or so later, I was asked to write some articles. I was asked to speak at retreats or day-long days of gathering by different organizations, and I would tell my story. That was the first time I told my story. You see, nobody talked about it because my circle was so small, everybody knew.
That must be quite profound to be invited to talk about. Right. That was that potential for what, even though you've done work with people and even though you're, that must have been quite something.
It was the narrative, and that's why I started my book with the first chapter is learning how to tell your stories. because we have to cross this ocean of grief, no matter what the story is. But we have to put it on our shoulders. And at first, it's so huge, we're wobbling. But we must master that story, that narrative. And at first it controls us,
Yes.
but eventually it's something that will always be with you, but it does not take everything from you. It starts to give back because you start to give from that story. But in the beginning, it's how can you tell your story?
And did you find then from beginnings of that, was this transformation thing then beginning to happen? Were people connecting with you? Were you getting also some of this, something rich that was experiential, that was happening, that you were becoming aware of, that was the core of this thing, that you'd been also fascinated by this real transformation? Was that beginning to happen?
That's a really good question, because I think unbeknownst to me, or certainly unintentional, was I began to see what good could come out of this,
Right.
this destruction. And that is really the key to life, isn't it? You know, things happen to break down and destroy structures, jobs, people, relationships. But then we rebuild. It's the oldest metaphor, because it's not even a metaphor, it is.
Well, what you're saying, this is where what you're saying is so powerful and rich, because from chaos comes creation, and from creation comes chaos.
Right.
Chaos, and it's interweaving. And at this time that we're speaking, and I guess you could have taken any time, and probably in human history it's always been kept. But one of the things that strikes me is that the one thing that we haven't really done is this thing hasn't really evolved to where this space is. And I can't help but think that often internationally, between people's, from first of all, on a one-to-one level, often in relationships, the siblings who are arguing as kids never get to that point of appreciation, acceptance. They're still battling.
Right.
And colleagues at work, the boss and the thingy. Then you get to neighbours, and then you get to sometimes communities, and then you get villages and different faiths, or this or that, or you know, all this kind of nonsense that happen in that separation, in that fear. Are you aware that there is that broader level to your work when you go and do some of the international work that you've done? Maybe tell us a little bit about that. Are you aware that this is really about helping people really to find peace and to move beyond trauma on all levels? Are you aware that the work's broadened out into that?
Right. It's still, at least in the past, has been about preparing organizations to work with traumatized people.
Right.
Because, as you're saying, the trauma level in the world today is, I think, just beyond the beyond.
Right.
But I'm sure during the world wars, but there seems to be this persistent.
So tell us a little bit about that. Tell us a little bit about that. What kind of organisations, if you can, tell us a bit about them. What's the things that are helping them to prepare for? Just to give us a flavour.
Well, in the international organisations, it could be Canada, it could be Europe. I just came back from giving a training in Prague, and there I worked with social workers who are staff and volunteers at a state-run organization that will help victims. So we spent 2 days in helping them understand the victim's experience, the trauma, and the protocol of my book, how people move through trauma, how to assist them, and really how to understand the nature of trauma. Because people don't understand that.
Yeah,
their hearts are open, they want to work
Right,
with it. So
right.
And the second day is always about the staff or volunteer or caregiver learning how to take care of themselves because of compassion fatigue.
Right.
Huge. People are just, everybody's on the front line all the time. And if you work in the field, if you're a therapist, a healer, a doctor, or even any kind of volunteer or staff person,
Yes.
and sometimes you don't realize that you are experiencing secondary trauma.
This is a really important point. It just suddenly brought back to me, I think that just toward the end of the time, I was a Samaritan volunteer here in the UK, and I was fortunate enough to be co-director of the Central London branch for a period of time. And I think just toward the end of my time was when I think the 7/7 bombings happen, and some people are supporting people, I think, in various places, including some of the underground places where it happened. And you point on to so many things that are really important. There's on that individual level the fact that traumas will happen, and that journey that the individual and that space and that support also that individual might need. But then you point to this bigger level that there are so many levels on which there may well be trauma going on. We've just had, unfortunately, a couple of awful air disasters. There's trauma going on in bits in the Middle East and all sorts of other places. And this thing about where people are often supporting people, and it could also be on a lower level. You could just be working in a busy hospital or clinic and you're seeing this day in, day out. And that this stuff about the compassion fatigue, do you see a separation between those who are almost in that healing profession and they're almost fatigued, and then maybe most of us where we're not even on that compassionate radar, or we're not really even in tune with that heart side? And it's quite a big question, it just kind of came to me.
But I think about it a lot, because in my individual work, right, which is sort of mirrors the organizational work, I see trauma in everybody. Yeah, maybe not to the level of working on the front lines, but the level of trauma in the world affects everyone.
Right. So you saying, for example, that with the example there, the trauma just might be, I'm just so caught up in how am I going to find this next job, or this trauma of how am I going to keep my, which creates
there's
these.
There's that. The personal trauma. But there's also reading the paper.
Right.
For example, I was here before I moved here, and when the soldier Lee Rigby was killed, I happened to be watching the BBC, and there was the video of the guy with the bloody knife. Now, I found that traumatizing, and I think any human being watching that on the streets of London. So there's that element where we're always seeing that. So what it does, in my opinion, is ratchets up the level of everybody's stress, so that looking for that job and thing and taking care of the kids and you're already stressed out. This is why people want to go home and they want to close their doors.
What you're saying is so powerful, it's so profound. And do you think that's also where sometimes that ability to even have the empathy or the real connectivity, even within those closed doors, is often isn't there, because we've had to shut or not open up?
Yes, because how much of it can you honestly take? So actually what people do is, it's not that they're not empathetic, they just have compassion fatigue. Like, how many problems are there in the world before you want to go into a room and not deal with anybody? And of course, I think some of the media has aggravated that, because it's all about the fear. It's all about, we don't have the good news, the real good news, other than the Hallmark moments, which are largely sentimental, of people really
of all the rich, so we don't hear that. So we don't hear, again, in terms of that story, we don't hear that side of the story. Before we close, because, and I'm sure there could be many others of these, and if I were watching this, I would be struck, fascinated, and really wanting to hear far more. I want you to tell us a little bit about transformation. I really do want you to tell us a little bit about transformation, because this is so important, and it's often the bit that we, you talked about on that person, that we can't see. What is that transformation on that very individual level, and let's perhaps explore it on that global level? Because for me, I think it's very important, and I've got some clear views about that, but I really would like to hear how do we go on this just transformative journey, and what's that about?
Well, that's a pretty big question. We'll try to get to some of it, right? I think that the first order of business is being present. And what you said earlier, living life while you still have time, being present in the moment and having gratitude for whatever it is you do have. Because there is, you can
I've got food on the table.
Right.
I've got food on the table.
And you can always lose something else.
Right.
Right?
What you're saying is profound here at this moment, just because it's so important. I want to pause you there. One of the things that, often we'll have, maybe we'll recognise this, I mean, this mainly, probably most people who are watching this maybe in the West, very often it might well be that for however long you've been on the planet, 1 decade, 2 decade, 3 decade, 4 decades, if you like it, however many decades, 5 decades, that somehow you've continued to have an extra day and you've somehow been nourished and whatever. Any level of that, the gratitude for that, which we so rarely have. So that being present, that you say, is the first step.
I think that being present and having gratitude which is optimism.
Right.
For the future, gratitude for the present.
Right.
Right? Understanding that it could all be taken away at any moment. So I would so hope that I'm thankful for now.
Mm-hmm.
That also enables you to look at whatever event is happening towards the transformation aspect of it rather than the destruction.
What you're saying here is very profound, you know, Kathy. It's very profound. It's that realization, whatever I have here could be taken away. So it could be me physically being here, it could be the loved ones, it could be this particular job, the trappings I have. It could all go, which of course is reality, because we're all going to be finite on that level of flesh, blood, and so on. And it strikes me that there's something quite powerful and profound that deepens that gratitude and perhaps opens us up to transformation and just change generally, right? It just changes one's sensibility. I almost feel more, as you talk about that, translucent.
Right.
As you describe
because
that.
the change is going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
There's no point holding on so tightly, locking your doors so nothing comes in to take it away. It will happen.
Mm-hmm.
The question is, and Viktor Frankl said this in his book, he was the one who lived in the concentration camps, he wrote Man's Will to Meaning. And what he said is he realized in the camps that the only freedom that had not been taken away in the camps was the freedom to respond to what was happening to you. That was something that only you can give that away. And you see, that's the essence of transformation to me. Whatever happens is going to happen. But we don't go at it with, oh, well, whatever, fateful. We go at it with strength. That we will, in fact, try our best to respond from our deepest self and our wounded self.
And there's something about
because
that.
there's no, let me just finish
yeah.
that. There's no, oh, well, it's, you know, I'm not going to feel, oh no. Oh no, it will take you to the depths of your being. But will you come up again? Or will you allow this event to destroy you? It's really quite that simple.
And it's quite extraordinary when you say that. I was just, as you began to say that, the thing came up, there was that thing about the spirit, and then the human spirit, as you said that then points to that place, doesn't it? And that interconnectivity. There's something about that strength, because sometimes I guess we might be even unaware of the depths of our strength or our compassion or just the qualities that we've had or what we've done, because we've been just so numb to it in either just being, you know, the what we described about before we close the doors, the compassion fatigue, or just not being present fatigue and so on. Something about that just revealed to us our strength, our possibility, and that magic of this extraordinary experience that we're in, right? That to me points to that, and it makes one curious about that.
Right, because you never know how you're going to react. That's the thing. That's why, you know, in my book I talk about, you know, the life preservers when you're struggling in the ocean, and they are, you know, courage, faith, hope, optimism, joy, humor, compassion, because those are universally recognized human characteristics. We don't know we have them until something really bad happens. Then we may have to search for them. You know, maybe we have to read about people who have embodied them. We have them, but we often take them for granted. But they are the finest human characteristics.
Right. So these characteristics, you talked about the presence, you talked about the gratitude, you talked about this thing about the whatever it is I have that might be taken away. And then these other qualities that you point to, these seem to be the real life enhancers. First of all, they might be the life rafts, but then they become something transformational.
Right, because maybe during that transformation, when you're struggling in the ocean of change, you locate within yourself these qualities of humanity. And they lead you into the transformation because you realize things about yourself you never knew.
Right.
And by the way, that doesn't mean that all through this process it's going to be your finest hour. Most of us are going to have some pretty bad reactions to it, and that's okay. That's humanity. But we also can hold these aspirational things, this courage. You know, I think I've been, about World War I, Britain's we're about to celebrate the centenary. Those people, what they found in the First and Second World War here, and the courage that they had. And I'm sure there were lots of people doing not great things, but many people had their finest hours. They found out things about themselves they didn't know.